Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Podcast Daily. This is Bill Landis, and today we are starting a look at some of Ohio State's, let's call them more interesting opponents in 2023. We're not going to go through the whole schedule, but I wanted to pick out a handful of games as we get closer to the season so we can learn a little bit more about some of these opponents that Ohio State will be facing. And of course, we're going to start with the team that Ohio State is opening the season against. That is the Indiana Hoosiers. And to learn a little bit more about that program and where they're at heading into the season, we are joined by Zach Osterman. He covers the Hoosiers for the Indy Star. He's looking very relaxed as he joins us from Indiana. Zach, I think that our listeners are aware that this is the second time that you and I have done this. So we appreciate your patience and coming on to share some expertise with us again.
No, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me twice.
Yeah.
Cleveland.com only ever has me once, so it's funny. Like Ohio State, I probably do more podcasts, radio, off season. Can you just come on and talk for 10 minutes? It's like Ohio State is like 60% of it in basketball, and then the other 40% is the rest of the conference. And then I suspect I don't do it as much, but I suspect Indiana basketball is the same way. Like everybody just. Can you come on and talk about how things are going there with Nebraska basketball for just a few minutes, just to update us, just to give us an idea for where things stand?
Yeah, well, the problem is we have to talk about Ohio State every day of the year, and eventually we run out of things to talk about. So we have to bring on guys like you to give us a little extra bit of content to get us through until the season starts. So we do greatly appreciate it. I want to start here, Zach. So Ohio State has had a couple of these Big Ten road openers. They had one at Indiana a few years ago. They had one at Minnesota 2 years ago, and they tend to get a little tricky for the Buckeyes. Both of those games, they were actually losing at the half. And I guess that's my way of asking you. Like, I understand you're not an expert of exactly where Ohio State is, but you have a pretty good idea, I think, of where Indiana is or where it wants to go. Does this look to you like a roster and a team that, I'm not saying, they're not going to put an upset scare into Ohio State, but given that Ohio State has stubbed its toe a little bit in these Big Ten road openers, do you think Indiana is in any way built to make it a little more interesting maybe than people are expecting with a spread that's already 4 touchdowns and we're a month away from the game?
Maybe, and I preface this by saying I understand where all the skepticism comes from with Indiana. That number one, the last couple seasons have been what they've been. Number two, there's been a ton of roster turnover. Tom Allen took the defense back, and then he handed it off again, and he brought Walt Bell in to coordinate the offense last season, and it never really got going. And you always kind of got the sense that sort of what Indiana wanted to be and what Indiana had, maybe particularly a quarterback. And I'm not picking on Connor Bays. Like, listen, they recruited him, they handed him the job, but that there was always a bit of a disconnect there. And then you look at just Indiana as a team now, and I know we talked about this in take one, but I mean, Indiana could start transfers literally almost every position, both sides of the ball. They're going to start a quarterback that, we will know next to nothing about, whoever it is. Taven Jackson and Brendan Sorsby are the two front runners. They're both redshirt freshmen. Sorsby was a late add to his recruiting class who didn't get to campus till last June. Jackson was an incredibly successful high school quarterback in Indianapolis, and if you're making me handicap it as best I can, which isn't very good right now, I'd probably say he's the slight favorite. But he's thrown, I forget what it is, but, less than 20 passes in college. He went to Tennessee. He redshirted, then he transferred to IU. My point is, there is so much uncertain around Indiana, and I understand why Vegas, why fans, why the conference, whatever, Athlon Sports, whoever you're talking to, is going to buy low on that. In a game like this, I think the one curiosity is that an advantage? Because I think Indiana is going to do some pretty different stuff offensively. Walt Bell's still here, but as he's fond of saying, and has been since the day he took the job, you can do a lot of different things out of the air raid. It's not just throwing the ball 70 times a game. And I think Indiana is going to try and do some different things. I think Indiana has, at very least, the sort of person coaching his offensive line now that you say if he can't fix it, then probably no one can. Bob Bostad, who is at Wisconsin for so many years. Matt Guerrieri is an interesting hire at defensive coordinator who is going to know more than the average about Ohio State. And Ohio State's going to be coming in with a new offensive coordinator, new quarterback.
Yeah.
Not a completely new backfield, if I'm not mistaken, but obviously some things are going to have to sort of be reshuffled and remixed. And my point is, if Indiana does have some juice, it's going to be hard to tell right now, just because everything stays so bland and so vanilla in spring, and there's so much has changed, so many new faces. A defense that's going to be hugely populated with transfers and young guys that haven't played a lot. And even if they've been in Indiana the last year or two, haven't played a lot in Indiana yet. And so, again, I understand why everybody's buying low on that. I think the one advantage Indiana has for the first part of the season, not just Ohio State, but also that Louisville game, maybe also is deep into the season, is the Maryland game, is nobody's really going to know what to make of Indiana initially. And so I think that uncertainty, that sort of mystery is something I think Indiana's got to find a way to mobilize and weaponize.
The thing that interests me, I guess, at this point, and I know like we're still a ways away from the game, so I'm not trying to do like a nitty gritty game preview here, but Ohio State is going to have like a fairly new offensive line. They're going to have 2 new starting tackles, a new starting center. And we've seen Indiana in the past like really dial up the pressure against Ohio State. Maybe not so much last year, but definitely like that 2020 game comes to mind. And I know that the Tom Allen, just sort of as a way of doing business, likes to do that. You mentioned Matt Guerrieri. He's former Jim Knowles' assistant, was the co-defensive coordinator at Duke, was an analyst at Ohio State for 1 year, and then was supposed to go to Tulsa with Kevin Wilson and is now the defensive coordinator at Indiana. What's that going to look like? Or do you have a thought of what that's going to look like? Is it Matt Guerrieri running Tom Allen's stuff? Is it Matt Guerrieri running his defense? And I guess to the point of being exotic and dialing things up and being uber aggressive, do you anticipate them doing that against the Buckeyes, especially given what the turnover is for Ohio State on the offensive line?
Yeah, the short answer is that Tom Allen's defense is always going to blitz. Like, that's just how it's built. And there are some curiosities around this team. I think that this team could have some better individual pass rushers than what we've seen Indiana have in the past. Indiana has not had a double-digit sack season from an individual player since 2008. So even in years where Indiana's been in and around the top of the conference in sacks and pressures and havoc rate and things like that, it's always been, at least under Tom Allen, it's always been, at least decently sort of based around scheme. If you understand what I'm saying, that it's the players making plays, but it's the scheme that's creating the opportunities, and I don't expect that to change. There's also obviously precedent, both good and bad, for Tom Allen kind of handing off that defense, and when it was Kane Womack, who Allen had worked with before, who Allen literally took the defense from Kane Womack's dad. That's who he learned I guess if you want to put it down on paper, it's a 4-2-5. That's who he learned it from, Dave Womack. When it was Kane, Allen was happy to let him experiment and tinker and kind of put his own stamp on things. And then when Kane left and the Indiana hired Charlton Warren, I think Allen took a similar hands-off approach and wound up, very uncomfortable with, just not necessarily that Warren was, I don't know if he was bad at the job so much as he got too far away from what Allen wanted to underpin the defense, and he was trying to do things that just kind of basically wound up kind of in conflict with just the basic defensive principles, and that led to a whole bunch of breakdowns. One of the myriad questions around this team is basically going to be where Allen and Guerrieri have met this offseason. And Allen has seemed really enthusiastic about working with Matt Guerrieri. He obviously came, incredibly well recommended. I think it's amusing to people around here that he ever so briefly spent time on Kevin Wilson's Tulsa staff. It seems like that, Indiana football sometimes feels a little bit like Kevin Bacon, for a program of relatively modest history, Indiana football has touched an awful lot of corners of the sport. But I think that one of the many sort of defining and unanswerable questions of the season to come for Tom Allen is going to be basically what you're talking about, which is, can Allen and Guerreri get to a place where, Guerreri is comfortable enough with the fundamentals of what Allen wants on defense? Because just like Ryan Day offensively, or just like, Lincoln Riley offensively, somebody else may be coordinator, somebody else may even be calling plays, but ultimately it's going to start with, this is my offense, and sort of this is how you can build from that. Can Guerreri really kind of get comfortable with where Allen is there, and then can Allen sort of meet Guerreri somewhere in the middle where he's able to kind of really act as a defensive coordinator in the same way that Kane Womack was able to really grow that into one of the, most disruptive defenses across 2019 and 2020. Again, if you look especially at some of the advanced numbers like havoc rate, and Indiana had enormous success just creating all kinds of problems for opposing offenses, opposing quarterbacks. They'd allow some yards, but they'd make a ton of big change plays. That is, again, especially on a defense, the defense in particular is where you're going to see an enormous amount of turnover. Indiana had kind of held on to that generation of guys that came in 2018, in 2019, obviously had, between 2018 and 2020, they won something like 19 or 20 games and went to a couple bowls and beat Purdue and all that stuff. And obviously the last couple of years didn't go quite as well, but Tywan Mullen was still around. Devon Matthews was still around. Bryant Fitzgerald was still around. Most of those guys are gone now. And what's going to be in their place defensively, with one or two exceptions, is guys that either transferred in the last 2 years, or guys that have, are basically like freshmen, redshirt freshmen, sophomores. And so that defense is probably as much as people are going to look at the uncertainty around quarterback, and I understand why, it's just the nature of the position, that defense is the piece of this team that is just kind of the most sort of, could be all one thing, could be all another. It's just impossible to pin down. And you could paint me almost any scenario, for the 2023 IU football defense, and I could see a plausible path to that outcome.
You did mention something there. Like this is a defense that over the years, like, has, regardless of whether it's been, one of the better defenses of the Big Ten, which it has been at times, or closer to the bottom, like, it's always had a couple of guys, like dudes, like NFL caliber players that I think can be disruptive. Who are those guys now, or who do people think could be those guys as Indiana, or does that guy exist? Do they have those guys at all heading into the season?
Yeah, I think there's a couple. I think, and I'll literally just pull up the roster here because I've been so turned off by vacation that I should sort of refresh my own memory. Aaron Casey is still around at linebacker, and I think that's, is he disruptive? Is he maybe a little bit more of just kind of the steady hand at the till, if you're the tiller, if you want to say? I think it's important one way or another for Indiana to have him, because it Tom Allen's best defenses have always had one or two really experienced linebackers in the middle that just kind of that call everything out, and that just kind of marshal everything on the field. Tom Allen leans heavily on that position, and he has, pretty much as long as we've known him. I think Miles Jackson was quietly, he plays kind of that hybrid bull position that's sort of a linebacker. He's listed as a linebacker, but he's kind of a bit of a linebacker, a bit of an end. Had some good moments last season. He's a transfer from UCLA. The guy I think a lot of people are curious about is Andre Carter, who transferred in from Western Michigan. And when you looked at his film, when you looked at his profile, you were, I mean, I'm not trying to be mean or whatever, but you were a little bit surprised that he picked Indiana when I think he had some SEC offers and things. He, the last the last 2 seasons at Western Michigan, he had 19 tackles for loss and 9.5 sacks. And 13.5 tackles for loss and 7 sacks last season, 68 total tackles. And he had a really, really good spring. Again, you don't want to draw too many conclusions from spring because things tend to be kept really vanilla, really sort of fundamental and basic. But sometimes that also makes it easier to spot just guys that are individually good, because it's a lot more about kind of just their individual talent and making plays. And he had a number of moments that kind of popped off the page. And then the other question, is always Indiana's always done some creative stuff with its defensive backfield and how it lines some guys up and where it blitzed from. And I think they kind of got away from that in the last couple of years to their detriment. I can't tell you, exactly what they might be trying to do here in terms of, do they have like a Jamar Johnson or a Tywone Mullen?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not even a guy that winds up being an All-American, but a guy that can just be sort of that playmaker that, Ohio State fans will remember. Jamar Johnson, I think he had an interception in that game, but he also had that one blitz that led to, I think, an interception where he just came straight up the middle, right into Justin Fields' face. And then, of course, Tywone Mullen was a very good, basically anywhere you put him on the field when he was healthy at Indiana. So do they have somebody in that secondary that can be a bit of a game changer, and maybe can be a little bit disruptive, not just in coverage, but when maybe Indiana wants to get creative with its blitzes. So I think there are guys there that can make plays. I am, I don't want to say skeptical, but I think the one area of that defense that you sort of look at is, do they have, again, typically Tom Allen's defenses have had really good playmaking linebackers. Cam Jones, Micah McFadden, Aaron Casey is one of them. And he's back, but the other two are gone. Can Indiana find some of that again? I think that would be important. But there are certainly at least some individually profile-wise, some guys that you look at and say, yeah, he could be a difference maker for IU there. But a lot of them are guys that either A, maybe we saw in limited capacity last season, or B, are brand new, and it's just tough to know exactly what to expect.
Yeah, I do think if this game does get a little interesting, that's probably where it happens. If there's enough mystery with Indiana's defense that it can surprise Ohio State, and enough transition on Ohio State's offense with the new coordinator, new quarterback, new offensive lineman, that maybe they stall out a couple times and this game ends up a little tighter than they're thinking. Because I don't see a situation where like Indiana comes out and unexpectedly like moves the ball and scores a bunch of touchdowns against Ohio State's defense. At least that's based off what I saw last year. So I guess I'll get to that. Like, I was perplexed watching Indiana on offense last year, not just at like the dearth of talent, but also the strategy of playing so fast, so ineffectively. Is that I guess like the pace, is that going to continue? Has there been any talk of like adjusting maybe that methodology? If we're going to be bad, let's try to hold on to the ball at least a little bit longer.
Yeah, I don't know how much slower Indiana's going to play. And again, that's one of those things where if they are going to play slower, they're certainly not going to tell us they're going to play slower. They're just, like that's one of those things I think they would keep to themselves. I do think things will look different. I think Indiana's going to have some bigger bodies at wide receiver, which is maybe going to make life a little bit easier for quarterbacks. I think whoever the quarterback is, again, I'm not trying to pick on Connor Bazelak. Again, Indiana recruited him. Indiana gave him the job. But having said that, it became clear as the season wore on that there were just some things that he was a little bit limited in, both the throw game and certainly using his feet, that Indiana probably needed more of. And even though Dexter Williams didn't set the world on fire throwing the ball when he got the QB1 job late in the season, the offense suddenly had a lot more juice because it had more dynamism, and suddenly going fast didn't feel quite like such a detriment, because suddenly Indiana was tearing off, chunks of 6, 7, 8 yards at a time in the drives that were working. And I think that whoever the quarterback is, the offense will be more dynamic that way this season. I also think, and listen, you need depth and you need some luck with injuries and things like that. But I also think Indiana is going to, with a fair wind, Indiana is going to run the ball more this year. And I mean, they have, I am the chairperson for the skeptics committee of Tom Allen talking about the run game. Like every year he's been in Indiana, he's talked about running the ball more, and every year he's been in Indiana, Indiana's thrown it as much as anybody in the Big Ten. And if you look at, I think the offense that, frankly, I think he kind of wants to pattern a little bit after is the offense he saw Hugh Freeze run for so many years. Hugh Freeze had some good running backs, but honestly, Hugh Freeze's offenses were typically more pass leaning than run leaning most of the time. But this one, I think, number one, you've got maybe the most explosive player in the Big Ten in Jalen Lucas at running back. He's not an every down back by any means, but he's, I don't know if this is a fair comparison or not, but it is when he gets that seam on the edge, he reminds me of Tevin Coleman. Like that's the only other player I've seen in Indiana that has that sort of burst and that sort of acceleration. I remember someone saying, an NFL scout saying to me once, he was pointing at Tevin Coleman during a fall camp practice or something, and he said, "Do you know how many guys accelerate while they cut? Like he's accelerating while he's cutting upfield. That's not natural." And Jalen Lucas has that sort of ability to maneuver without slowing down. And I think Indiana is going to want to do more stuff, whether it's, read option, whether it's some sort of weird shotgun triple option, whether it's screen game, whatever. Indiana's going to want to get its running backs more involved. Because the other thing is Indiana's got Josh Henderson back, who was probably their best sort of every down back last season, certainly one of the two alongside Sean Shivers. Indiana's got a transfer from Wake Forest named Christian Turner, who had about 1,000 yards and 12 touchdowns across the last two seasons in this year. The point is Indiana's, the piece of the offense Indiana can trust the most right now is that backfield. And I think they're going to utilize it more for a variety of reasons. And so then if you are running the ball more, even if you're playing faster just by nature of the way your offense gains yards, achieves first downs, and in theory scores points, you're probably going to be, shortening the game for your defense. So the short answer to this is if Indiana is going to play slower, I don't think they're going to tell anybody. I think they're just going to do it. I don't think that there's suddenly going to become some sort of pronounced, like we hold the ball for 25 seconds between every snap. But I think there are going to be some changes to Indiana's offense conceptually that just lead to, if the offense works, some more sustained drives.
I'll get you out on this question. You've mentioned Taven Jackson a couple of times. Let's just assume that he's going to be the starter. Maybe he's not, and this will all be for not. But let's assume that he's going to be the starting quarterback. The recruiting pedigree looks pretty good, looks interesting, but he's not really done anything in college. I guess the high end projection for him. How does he compare to some of the other quarterbacks that you've seen come through Indiana, particularly during this era under Tom Allen?
Yeah, if we're talking high-end projection, he's got certainly the physical tools, the attributes, just in terms of what you would want from this sounds really cliche, what you would want a quarterback to look like, how you would want him to throw the ball, spin the ball. He was a player that really excelled in Elite 11 settings. In high school, he won a ton at his high school. Of course, he's Trace Jackson Davis's brother. His high school doesn't open things up and throw the ball a ton. And Carson Steele, who was Mr. Football in whatever that was, 2020, I think, and then obviously went to Ball State and is now at UCLA because he put up gaudy numbers across a couple seasons at Ball State. He shared a backfield with Carson Steele, so you're going to be handing the ball off a decent amount when you've got an all-state running back next to you. But when Center Grove needed Taven either to make plays with his legs or certainly to show off his arm talent, he did it, and he did it consistently. And just to be honest, and Ohio State fans will probably be at least somewhat aware of those teams because Caden Curry was on those teams too. Yep. I have been in I've lived in the state for 17 years, 18 years, something like that. And I don't know that I've ever seen a better high school football team here. That team was really, really good, and it had really high expectations. I mean, it placed a lot of expectation on itself, and I think Sorry, I'm getting emails while we're doing this. Let me just turn that off. And it rose to those every time, and I think it says something about a quarterback that Center Grove is as sort of illustrious of a program as the state has in football, and that team basically had expectations about as high as you could possibly have, in the largest classification in Indiana, and there was never really a moment where at quarterback Taven Jackson looked sort of like shy of those expectations or shied from those expectations, I should say. And so I think the tools are there. I do think it's worth Indiana fans remembering he is a very young quarterback. And if it's not him, then it'll be Brendan Sorsby, or I guess maybe Brock Lowry, who's a true freshman from Ohio. The point is, whoever it is, they will be very young. There will be mistakes. There will be moments where you'll say, why doesn't Indiana try something more, a little bit more layered, or why don't they adjust to this or that? And the answer may be because the quarterback's not ready for it, whoever it is, just because, it's really easy to forget. We spend so much time talking about how much time these kids spend playing football and thinking about football and working out and whatever. And we forget that, like, the reality is Taven Jackson, as an example, is still just in his second year of college football. That's not a lot of time. But I do think if it is him, I think he's got a lot of really good upside. I think he can be more mobile than what Indiana had at quarterback last season. I think he would be comfortable maybe in an offense that ran the ball a little bit more. And the other thing too is, and what I mean by that is not so much that I don't think he can throw it a ton. I think he's good with the idea of a more holistic offense. I'm not sure he's going to come in and think, oh, I need to throw the ball 60 times a game. And the other thing too is there's worse places to be pulling a quarterback from than Tennessee right now. Like, I mean, there's worse quarterback rooms to be dipping into and bringing kids in and just sort of saying, what'd you learn there? Like, what are they doing over there? What's in the water down in Knoxville? Although if you've seen the river running through Knoxville, you probably know. That's a little SEC trash talk because I grew up in the South, and that's how I like to roll. But I think I think there's a lot of upside. I think he's got a lot of really good tools. What I've said all along is whether it's him, whether it's Sorsby, it's going to be really important for fans to remember they're still just redshirt freshmen, and that's very young for any quarterback, no matter how good they are.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I find Indiana pretty intriguing. I don't know what they're going to be. It doesn't really sound like anybody knows what they're going to be, but it's an interesting opening opponent for Ohio State. We so appreciate Zach Osterman joining us for the second time to give us a snapshot of the Hoosiers as Ohio State gets closer to that opener for the 2023 season. Thank you to Zach. We really appreciate it. And thank you for listening here to an episode of the Podcast Daily. We'll catch you later.